Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Psychological Humanities and Ethics lecture at the Lynch School of Education and Human Development here at Boston College. It's our hope that this series continues to nourish our community as we grapple with the deeper questions about our responsibility and seek to be more ethically attuned as individuals and as a society. If you can believe it, we're in the final stretch of the academic year, and this is our last lecture in the lineup until we start back up in the fall. So we're delighted to be bringing the year to a close with tonight's speaker, Professor Stephen Chihai, who I'll introduce to you in just a moment. And he was drinking his tea. So here's what we have on tap for tonight. Here's what the structure will look like. First, I'll introduce Stephen and then hand it off to him. And at the conclusion of his talk, we'll open it up for our online audience to engage. So store up your questions. We'll seek your thoughts during the Q&A time later on. You'll be able to use the Q&A function to submit your questions. And we do anticipate actually having a good amount of time for meaningful engagement. Looking forward to that a lot. So now let me introduce you to our esteemed speaker. Stephen Chihai is currently the Mary L. Corneal Professor at Wellesley College's Susie Newhouse Center for the Humanities. He's coming to the end of this one-year appointment, and it's been really nice having him in the Boston area. I'm going to feel really sad when you head home. His home institution is William and Mary, where he is the Sultan Qaboos Professor of Middle East Studies, and he's also the founding director of the Decolonizing Humanities Project, which seeks to validate, elevate, and learn from knowledge practices and creative expressions of communities of color, natives and displaced peoples, and marginalized identities. He remains interested in and a perennial student of decolonial theory and praxis, psychoanalysis, and cultural and post-structural theory. Stephen's the author of 5 books, to name just a few. The most recent one published, co-authored with Dr. Lara Chihai, is Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, Practicing Resistance in Palestine. So we're delighted to have you here tonight and to learn from you and be a part of the work that you're doing in this world.
Thank you so much, David. You're clicking out a little bit, so hopefully that's on your end, not mine. So if there's a problem with the transmission, please tell me, and I will, I don't know, maybe try to switch rooms or something. So hopefully that would be okay. I want to thank you, David, and Mookie, and Darby, and Haley for your just all the work that you've done. Everyone at the Lynch School for Education and Human Development at Boston College, and this series of psychological humanities and ethics is really groundbreaking, and it's really very flattering to be a part of it. And thank you so much, and thank you for all your work. I just would also like to start off with also acknowledging that I'm speaking from occupied Massachusetts, Nipmuc, and Wampanoag land. And I try to make sure that, to not only acknowledge, to make these land acknowledgements, but also to acknowledge that there are Indigenous folks around, and that we are participating in settler colonial apparatuses that continue to displace Indigenous people all over the Turtle Island. And so it's important for me always to do that, because my own work, or much of my own work, also concentrates on Palestine and other settler colonial context. So thank you all. And today I'm going to give a talk that I sort of have been building on. So I ask, I'm grateful for you to allow me to sort of bounce this material off of you. I would like to mark that today is Cinco de Mayo, the defeat of the Mexican defeat of the French at the Battle of Puebla in 1862. It is also the birthday of Karl Marx. And as many of us know, May 6th tomorrow is the birthday of Sigmund Freud. Also 20 years ago today, Edward Said delivered his famous lecture, Freud and the Non-European, in London at the invitation of the Freud Museum. The Freud Museum extended that invitation upon learning that The Freud Society of Vienna canceled their speaking invitation to the Palestinian intellectual. This was the result of Edward Said throwing a stone at the Lebanese border with the state now known as Israel. In an interview, excuse me, with the New York Times, Johann August Schulein, the then president of the Freud Society of Vienna, said, quote, "A lot of members of our society told us that they can accept that we have invited an engaged Palestinian who throws stones against Israeli soldiers," unquote. On the 20th anniversary then of Freud and the non-European, we know this photograph well. You can post that photograph if you, Haley, thank you. Thanks. So within this convergence of commemorations, that is Cinco de Mayo, the Mexican victory of a colonial superpower, the birthdays of Marx and Freud, and yes, David Kierkegaard, and the 20th anniversary of Freud and the non-European, and the Freud Society's disinvitation of Said, and this Freud Museum's invitation to Said, as well as today being May 5th, the day to remember and advocate awareness for missing and murdered Indigenous women. These convergences, this convergence of commemoration makes me want to propose a particular formulation. I like to propose a formulation of how we think of theory in relation to the moment that it is practiced, what I'm calling the decolonial now. If, as Carl Jung says, the unconscious has no time, how can we read then acts in the moment, in the ever-present now, with equal significance and value as their place in the unconscious, and as well as their desired effect in creating a condition for the future, without vacating the contingencies and specificities within a past, present, future matrix. Of course, the decolonial now undermines the assumed difference between applied and theoretical psychoanalysis. I offer this image of Said and the stone as an opportunity to develop a method, a sort of decolonial dream work. This method is not excuse me. This method is not a textual unpacking or a practice of hermeneutics. Both familiar, yet still uncanny to psychoanalysis, the decolonial dream work tracks the condensation of displacements, projections, and contradictions within the image, and the unconscious and theory within the image. In doing so, however, I like to hold psychoanalysis and indeed post-colonial theory to its commitment to flesh out, literally give flesh to, displaced and marginalized material realities, political practices, and lived experience that cut across time and space. The decolonial now insists on locating the worldliness of theory, theory so central to these fields of psychology and humanities, which are both embodied theoretical practices. Edward Said has given us this concept of worldliness in his book, The Text, the World, the Text, and the Critic. This is not Spivak's worlding that adeptly tracks how natives are placed within a Cartesian nationalized world of the colonial author, administrator, and map maker. And it is more than Heidegger's being in the world. It is rather being of the world, a world of relationality with one another in a disavowed world governed by coloniality, whiteness, cis-heteronormativity, and capitalism. Said's worldliness communes with Edward Glissant, in particular his idea of tout monde, mondialité. For Glissant, the worldliness of the poetic text summons to the surface experiences in which we live together globally, perhaps opaquely, in relation to unshared worlds of exploitation and violence, but also creativity and beauty. In North American and European universities and psychoanalytic institutes, we are taught to consider the worldliness of people, objects, and texts, but never the worldliness of theory. We are, in fact, taught to domesticate, quarantine, and separate ourselves from worldliness in the realm of embodied psychoanalytic and radical social and cultural theory. Appropriated by institutes and universities, worldliness compresses Palestinian, Black, and Indigenous life. The phantasmatic spectrum of universal humanism, as Sylvia Wynter has taught us, has little space for a disruptive Black and Indigenous psyche, let alone being. Contrary to the institutes and universities' curriculum, worldliness does not mean that we all live and experience, share the same world in the same way, nor are our differences in relation to the world and one another a mere result of social constructs. Glissant is clear that mondialité is not universalism, and it's certainly not globalization, but a worldliness that is determined by our knowledge of the world and a knowledge of the world and a knowledge and experience constituted through communal, not individual experience, or perhaps filiative experiences if we combine Glissant and Said. In relation to the world, colonized, racialized, gendered, and marginalized subjects know a world that is otherwise imperceivable and illegible to those in power, to those in privilege, who themselves have dragged so many to the abyss, as Glissant says. Therefore, we return to the stone. We return to the moment of the stone in the hand of an Arab, Edward Said throwing the stone, Edward Said, the Arab, Edward Said, the Palestinian exile, whose family lives in exile in Lebanon, throwing the stone from Bab al-Fatima at the border created through a secret agreement between colonial bureaucrats, forged at the same time that the Arabs, who were promised independence, sided with the French and the British against their former Ottoman siblings, a border hardened by Fortress Israel. Edward Said, picking up a stone from the land, al-Ard. Said revealed himself to be of that land. He is not out of place, but of the place. Said divulged that the stone divulged that he was a native of that land. He held that stone, that soil. It held him. The image shows us that the stone was indistinguishable from him and indistinguishable from the worldliness of his theory. The stone showed that he is a Palestinian. He revealed, much to the horror of the Austrians, the Israelis, and many Americans, that he is of that land and he is of his theory. You can take down the picture. Thank you. Said violated something. It was not throwing a stone at a Jew, which did not happen. It was not throwing a stone at an Israeli soldier valiantly defending against the Arab horde, which did not happen. It was not Said throwing a stone at an empty Israeli watchtower over a border so saturated with settler violence. Said violated what Western academia and psychoanalytic institutes thought they agreed upon, a misreading of the worldliness of the engaged Palestinian intellectual. Excuse me. Let's remember Schulin's words. A lot of members of our society told us that they can accept that we have invited an engaged Palestinian who throws stones, unquote. Being an engaged exile, but never be an engaged militant native. The splitting is rather clear. Vienna wanted Said, the intellectual, without the worldliness of his intellect, a rational Said with texts, without the affective baggage of those texts. They wanted the Palestinian exile, a Palestinian without a country, a Palestinian without Palestine. But the rock shattered their disavowal. The rock tethers the Palestinian to Palestine. The rock is not a metonym for, but an actual material grounding to the land. It is the poem's unwinding back into its origins in the worldliness of place, space, and materiality. Glissant warns us against, quote, thinking thought that withdraws into a dimensionless place where the ideas of thought alone, persist alone, unquote. Instead, as expressed by poetry, he says, quote, thought in reality spaces itself into the world. It informs the imaginary of peoples, the varied poetics, which it then transforms, meaning that in them, thought risks becoming realized. I'm going to ask you to hold on to this for the time, that is, becoming realized and actualized in the world as a mode of consciousization. I hope to come back to that. But for now, I want to think about Said more. Said with that rock. Said with the rock realized Said with theory. Said is of place, but also of a collective moment of liberation. In this image and at that moment, Said exists in different points of time and space at the same time. He binds the intifada of the 1990s, of the 1980s, with an Aqsa intifada that was occurring at the very moment that he was throwing that stone. Unwinding this poem further, this decondensing of the poetic dream work of the photograph further, we recall that Said's visit to the border occurred shortly after the liberation of South Lebanon, months before by the Lebanese resistance. After 22 years of illegal Israeli occupation of South Lebanon that resulted in tens of thousands of deaths of Lebanese and Palestinians, not to mention the illegal detainment and torture of thousands of men and women by Israelis and their Lebanese proxies. The stone is an homage to the Lebanese resistance. The stone is a promise to the Palestinian people that resistance will succeed. Said famously states in Freud and the Non-European, I very much doubt that Freud imagined that he would have non-European readers, or that in the context of the struggle over Palestine, he would have Palestinian readers. But he did, and he does, unquote. Lara and my book, Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, is precisely about these readers, Palestinian readers of Freud, but also enactors of Freud, perhaps even redeemers of his theory. There are Palestinian readers of Said, enactors of Said. These are clinicians that make Freud's work meaningful in Palestinian worldliness. They make theory into a stone. Our book on Palestinian clinicians narrates where stones meet houses and Freud meets Palestinians. In these houses stolen by the settler state, we find Ali, a clinical psychologist. He tells us, quote, "The building where our clinical supervision by Israeli supervisors takes place is an old Arab house in which little, if anything, has changed since 1967. From the first time I stepped in this house in Talabiyah, a Jerusalem neighborhood, I felt a lump, sitting in a stolen house with colonizers, talking about a profession supposedly based on humanism and in support of humanity and the humane," unquote. Ali's story of supervision, one of many we were told, clearly depicts the spatiality, structures, and processes of settler colonialism writ large. But more so, the position of what Nadim Rohana calls the captive Palestinian citizen, or in this case, a captive Palestinian citizen supervisee, who seeks training in clinical psychology in the settler colonial state. Ali continues, "They look at you. You are less than. You know less. Your culture is less. They see us as if we come from nowhere. They want to give us the honor to be trained by them so they can help treat our people. They teach us. And yet, across the street from this house, only a few meters away, is another stolen house, Edward Said's house, and they have no clue." Saliently, Said in After the Last Sky reminds us that it was Martin Buber who, quote, subsequently lived in that house until his death, after the last members of the Said family were evacuated from their ancestral home. Ali further recounts his experience in supervision. He says, quote, "You are an Arab therapist. You are charged to treat Arabs of East Jerusalem in Arabic, the marginalized and weak population subject to occupation. You are sent to treat them with text written in Hebrew. You present the case of your patient in Hebrew to your Israeli supervisor. She lives in a colony on the land of your grandfather. She finds it hard to understand you, although she reassures you that she cares about the Arabs. She can't see any need for therapeutic intervention because the patient is low functioning, or in her words, the patient is a simpleton," unquote. The experience and insights of Ali allow us to make the central observation of this presentation, one essential if we are going to forge decolonial methodologies within psychoanalysis. That is, a parallel process between Ali and Said is at play. This parallel is not exclusive to them, but can be extended to the understanding of the positionality of those marginalized within a colorblind psychoanalysis, as David Ang and Chihai might say. This process, I am arguing, structures the very nature by which we approach and disavow the worldliness of psychoanalytic and post-colonial theory and their engagement with real subjects. Ali and Said show us how this theoretical engagement unequally unfolds in the shared spaces but unshared worlds of the colonizer and the colonized, the oppressed and the oppressor, and the marginalized and the privileged. Ali is surrounded by the undeniable material evidence not only of Palestinian dispossession, but Palestinian presence. Not just theory, but as stones and as patients that live in relation to one another. This presence stands in the face of condoned and even enforced structural disavows and by logics and apparatuses of the apartheid state, and directly or through ideological settler state apparatuses like Israeli-led clinical supervision. The ideological misattunement of the supervisor as Lara and Leilani Salvo Crane have called it, may not be intentional, but it is also not accidental. It arises from and serves very real, pointed, and practical ends, both towards the Arab trainee and the Arab patient. Excuse me. The ideological misattunement is elemental to what David Eng has identified as colonial object relations, where, quote, colonial modernity frames not only the material development, but also the psychic emergence of liberal subjectivity. And love and hate are affectively policed to create a field of good and bad objects and liberal and indigenous subjects regulated by a colonial morality that is not the cause, but rather the effect of processes of repair. Eng shows us that psychoanalysis itself is structured by, quote, affective contours of liberal reason, unquote. That these affective contours of liberal reason speak to a subjectivity itself that is fractured in relation to subjects and objects around it. This is, of course, the condition of modernity. Pointing to Eng's colonial object relations alerts us to the ways in which clinicians retreat into universalizing, unworlded theories in order to name and repair certain objects and, quote, leave certain objects unretrieved, unquote, as David would say. This uneven distribution falls along racial and gendered lines. Lara and I have shown the disavows that maintain normativity and ideological hegemony are not technical errors, but structural techniques that permit the clinician to retreat into and shore up the hegemony of universalizing theories and positionalities, which are built into the psychoanalytic practice. Psychoanalytic practice as yet one more, quote, site of power, as Gramsci and Stuart Hall teach us. And these sites of power conscript us to actively naturalize contradictions and the hegemony of modes of power and oppression. This inbuilt collusion with the state and many forms of normativity permit and indeed naturalizes what is considered good technique and sound theory. And this is what Lara and I call a move to psychoanalytic innocence, which is a form or inspired by Tuck and Yang's move to settler move to innocence, or Gloria Wecker's white innocence. The run to theory and abstraction is a symptom of critical disavows built into the profession. Psychoanalyst Avgi Sekatopoulou, sorry, Avgi, reveals that social structures of whiteness and empire saturate the psychoanalysis, the professional field itself. Explicitly in response to an institutional racial enactment in the context of Palestinian activism within the profession, Sekatopoulou shows us, quote, whiteness shores up itself by doubling down, by closing ranks at precisely the switch point where it becomes aware of its own racism, unquote. This switch point is where clinicians close ranks under the guise of psychoanalytic theory or technique in order to stabilize what I would call, playing on David Eng, the colonial reality principle. Yet, rather than dwell on the switch point where the supervisor pivots to psychoanalytic innocence, I would like to spotlight how racialized, colonized, and gender subjects are conscripted at this switch point moment. They are requested through enticements, identifications, or even coercion to collude with naturalizing settler colonial violence. Ali realizes that the Palestinian trainee is required not only to accept disavows, but reproduce settler colonial reality principle. His defiance exemplifies the ways in which Palestinian trainees, acknowledged as Arabs only, are operationalized to extend the sovereignty of the settler colonial state, and how this process is psychological as much as professional and political. The process is made to reproduce the captive colonial citizens' lack of interiority, to reproduce their inferiority, and of course, to foster and reproduce their dependence. The Palestinian trainee is expected to be a good Arab trainee, an appreciative Arab, a Hebrew-speaking Arab, not a bad Palestinian, a simpleton, primitive, Arabic-speaking, and ungrateful, as Fanon would note, and certainly not a stone thrower. The life work and memoirs of Chobani Manganyi, South Africa's most preeminent psychologist, describes in quiet and humbling ways this process of professional, bodily, and psychological conscription and disavowal required under apartheid. His first professional experience at the time as an industrial organizational psychologist was marked by being promptly fired when he honestly, yet quite naively, assessed and reported to his white employers that the reason why Black supervisors were leaving the business so frequently was actually racism. Surprise. This finding was known by all, but it was forbidden to be named. Manganyi experiences the very real disciplinary mechanisms in place to enforce the apartheid colonial reality principle. That these disciplinary mechanisms punish those who actually describe material reality. Manganyi states, following Fanon, that the Black psychologist remains, quote, being Black in the world, subject to racial disavowals built into the sociological schema of the Black body as prescribed by whites, unquote. The correlative analogy of Manganyi's life under South African apartheid is clear. Living in an apartheid state, Ali is aware of these mechanisms. Likewise, being Palestinian in the world, Said is made to understand these mechanisms meted out by Vienna. Also, there was an incredible outcry to have him fired from Colombia and a lot of hullabaloo as well that I'm not discussing. The colonial reality principle demands complicity with splitting. Psychoanalysis operates within this colonial reality principle as a practice that replicates the social demands of racial dissociation, as Eng and Han call it. Racial dissociation is a dissociation from the material and social realities structured by racial hierarchy and histories. And racial dissociation demands that one locate themselves in a disavowed, whitewashed, universalized, yet relativized selfhood. Racial dissociation requires not only dissociated states, as Bromberg suggests, but states of identification that compel a dissociated self from one's body. Eng and Han demonstrate how Asian Americans are hailed to dissociation and identify with whiteness, splitting their selfhood from the corporal epidermal schema of their bodies, as Fanon would say, in order to be rewarded as model minorities. Likewise, Palestinians are asked to dissociate. They are asked to dissociate from their bad pre-1948 selves and split into model captive Arab citizens. Ali is a non-compliant bad Palestinian supervisee, or Ali, the good Arab collaborator, willing to collude with the supervisor's psychoanalytic innocence as an extension of settler colonial sovereignty. Likewise, we are asked to split Said. Said, the celebrated yet domesticated literary critic of the post-colonial world, who we intentionally vacate of the worldliness and full potentiality of his theory. Said without Palestine, Said without his rock. Or Said's act in Lebanon is like his reading of Freud's reading of Moses. Quote, in Said's words, troubling, disabling, and destabilizing, unquote. The throw was the switch point, and Burgos 19 could not accept the worldliness of his theory or his practice. Regressed into his Arab primitive functioning, Freud's non-European is Said the stone thrower. I'm drawing attention to a confrontation with, and indeed refusal of, the colonial reality principle in favor of thinking about and accepting the reality principle of the colonized. As South African decolonial clinicians Shahnaz Sufla, Mohammed Sidat, Garth Stevens, Kopano Ratele, Christopher Son, Umesh Bawa, Shorsi Kesi, and Nick Malarby, and so many other amazing comrades in South Africa teach us that racialized formations within the coloniality of modernity do not just govern necro-capitalist and racist spaces, which exist adjacent to or separate from a world of liberal humanism. In other words, we don't have like necro-capitalism over here and good liberal humanism over here, right? They're not separate. Racial formations, rather, constitute the world of liberal humanism, which itself relies on fascism and racism to legitimate its own white supremacy in the form of white innocence and universalism. Psychoanalysis works to normalize and enforce this universalism, but also decolonial methodology acknowledges the clinician to be of the world where the colonized subjects collectively forge defiant lives of joyful livability. Therefore, foregrounding this affirming defiance, a decolonial method recenters the always split position of the racialized, the indigenous, the gendered, and the marginalized, whose psyche, body, and being are embroiled in perpetual racial enactments that constitute racial capitalism and liberal humanism itself. Not coincidentally, Eng and Han introduced the concept of racial dissociation through their discussion of W.E.B. Du Bois's double consciousness. In locating it there, allow me then to bend racial dissociations back into the realm of consciousization, as Ignacio Martin-Baro has taught us following Fanon and Freire. Resisting and refusing to racially dissociate, or in the case of white settlers, refusing to close ranks, is an act of consciousization. Martin-Baro shows us that, quote, in asserting that consciousization ought to be the principal feature in psychology's horizon, the task of the psychologist must be to achieve the de-alienation of groups and people. Through a gradual decoding of their world, people grasp the mechanisms of oppression and dehumanization, opening up the horizons to new possibilities for action, for possibilities of new praxis, to change social relations in order to produce new forms of consciousness, unquote, and I would add liberation. Lara and my work in Palestine hopes to elevate how Palestinian clinicians like Ali, whose lives and practices are circumscribed by control, violence, and settler-imposed death, operate internally and communally within a psychic political economy of life that works against alienation, against coercive social relations, and against the dissociative states demanded by the colonial reality principle. In this presentation, Said and Ali both work within a psychic political economy of life and consciousization, where they defy dissociation or being objectified as victim within a psychic economy of colonial object relations. The Palestinian intellectual and the Palestinian clinician speak against historical trauma, not out of a denial of this trauma, but by insisting on the material worldliness of post-colonial and psychoanalytic theory that, quote, decodes, in Martin-Baro's words, and makes sense of their own lives, past, present, and future, in the perpetual decolonial now. Struggling to maintain dignity, commitment, and responsibility to themselves as individuals and their communities, consciousization of their practice is the concretization of their theory. In the words of Nader Shalhoub Kevorkian, the psychic political power emanating from the settler colonial sites of death generate a collective psychosocial embodiment of everyday resistance. Like London's invitation to Said as a response to, London's invitation to Said as a response to Vienna's disavowal and disinvitation, this presentation, therefore, is an invitation for psychoanalysis. It's an invitation for psychoanalysis to consider each moment as a moment of decolonial now. It is an invitation to refuse the disavowals that colonial settler principles require of it, that require of it as a part of the wages psychoanalysis must pay to operate within the liberal economy of repairing the violence and wounding that cis heteronormative, racial, settler capitalism inflict on all of us. In throwing the stone on the convergence of these birthdays of Freud and Marx and the defeat of the French Empire, I am encouraging acts of epistemic insurgency, as Catherine Walsh might say. Epistemic insurgency that require us to grasp the worldliness of the stone and the worldliness of the theory that we dare to swear by. At the intersection where Freud is welcomed by Palestinians, and where a psychoanalysis of consciousization and disalienation lives within liberated Palestinian homes, the decolonial now inhabits the worldliness and fullness of our theory in the moment of its actualization. The stone anchors Palestinians to their lives. The stone anchors to these lives to their land, not in the past, not solely in an aspirational future, but in the now, from the river to the sea. Against offering a decolonial dreamwork as a methodology to make this ever-present now legible, I want to rewire a poem by Palestine's most famous poet, Mahmoud Darwish, a poem that's called I Wish I Were a Stone. I want to rewire this poem not as a poetics of exile, but a poetics, as Brisson would say, of a relationality, a poetics of being in the world, and a poetics of being in the now, or being of the now. لا أحن إلى أي شيء فلا أمس فلا أمس يمضي ولا غد يأتي ولا حاضري يتقدم أو يتراجع لا شيء يتحدث لي. I don't yearn for anything. No yesterday passes, no tomorrow comes. My present does not go forward, nor does it go backwards. Nothing happens to me. ليتني حجر قلت يا ليت حجر ما لي سقلني الماء أخضر أصفر أدعو في حجرة مثل منخوط أو تمارين في المحط أو مادة لي انبثاق الضروري من عبث اللا ضروري. يا ليت الحجر كي أحن إلى أي شيء. I wish I were a stone. I said, I wish. A stone to make water polish me smooth, green, yellow, put in a room like something sculpted, practicing sculpting, or something for the necessary emergence from the unnecessary mess. I wish I were a stone to yearn for anything. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. That was absolutely wonderful. And the call to epistemic insurgency and to seeing the power of the now is it's so important for us. I mean, in terms of all of human history, but especially I think this moment that we're living, where I think this gets buried under a lot of different types of discourses, and you've stated it so clearly and evocatively. So thank you for bringing your wisdom and your scholarship to these questions. I'd like to ask the audience to start playing with us a bit. So please put questions in the Q&A area. I already see a question there, which I'll come to in a second, but store up things now, start typing it out so I can pose it to Stephen. One thing is, as our participants are starting to pull those thoughts together, one thing I was thinking about as I was listening to you is a very good friend, a mentor of mine, Mark Freeman out of College of the Holy Cross. He wrote an article in 2000 called Theory Beyond Theory. And he was very concerned about the ways in which the use of theory, which is ostensibly a means of trying to, pull out into this universal enough form to see with some degree of objectivity or systemization in order to have a clearer understanding of sort of a cohesive system or plausibility structures, right? That the theory is meant to do that. And so it's seductive and enticing in its alleged power to do so. But in actuality, it creates a type of abstraction and distance that deprives us of the very oxygen of experience itself. And he, in this article, calls us to sort of the poetics of the other. So you spoke a bit of the poetics and even ended with poetry as one of the, I think, the insurgent techniques of trying to call us back. And in his article, he pulls from Stephen Toulmin's Cosmopolis and sort of looks at how modernity itself took the shape it did, in part because it was trying to pull away from perspectivalisms such that it could somehow achieve a God's eye view or a transcendent enough perspective to free us from all the horrible folklore distances that we had from one another and actually get to the thing itself, right? But that how interesting it is that liberalism emerged from, and liberal humanism emerged from that desire, and that in many ways we think of it as the very means of freedom from all the horrible warfare that we had seen prior to more objective modern perspectives. But then in actuality, that has not been the case. And I want to actually ask you a question at the end of this, but I'll just quickly keep going with this line of thought, and that is Simon Critchley reads Emmanuel Levinas, who's my guy, as saying that liberalism is actually something that makes us deeply susceptible to fascism. That oftentimes liberalism, the liberal subject, is the most susceptible subject of them all to fascist mindsets and racist mindsets. And that in part, that's because at the core of liberal humanism is the call for us to build social order based on abstractionism and of a theoretically distant way of understanding ethical and moral nature, or to use your word, sort of non-worldly mediators, like that human dignity should be something we all ascribe to, right? That sounds really good, but in terms of it having any elemental element, any libidinal juice to it whatsoever, there's none. And so we're hoping that non-libidinal ideas somehow will actually allow us to stay tethered in deeply peaceful, humane ways. And in actuality, it makes us ravenous and makes us far more likely to go back to blood and soil. And so that's Levinas's deep concern, that Hitlerism would always win the day as long as the liberal subject is ordered by this abstractionism. And so part of what I hear you saying today is something very similar, but taking it into decolonial studies in a way that is really, really wonderful and challenging. But I'd love to hear you speak a little bit more to, you had said liberal humanism is not separate from the fascist and racist thing, but rather they touch one another in a significant way. And that's what got me on that line of thought. But I'd love to hear you speak even a little bit more to that if you feel so inclined.
Yeah, that's a big question. I mean, I think that's a massive question, right? Like, where do you enter into that question? And I think maybe, we all, I mean, in today, where fascism is a real thing, right? It's a real thing. It's not like it's not. It's I was telling Lara the other day, like I remember George Bush Sr. and being in college, he was, going up against Clinton, and people putting all over Philadelphia stickers like Bush is a fascist. And I would think like, I was an anarchist, so I'm like, I'm not loving on the guy. I was like, is he actually a fascist, right? And then now you're like, no, these people are fascists, right? The fascism is around. Fascism is here, and the country is fascist, right? And but then you think about like, what is like the counter to that, right? And then you think about someone like Biden, and then there's discourses, and I'm just kind of thinking about in what ways is liberalism, let's say, just say in this country, to sort of doing that work, right? For fascism. And fascism, what it does is it just doesn't run away from the critiques, the contradictions of capitalism. It sort of elevates them, right? Elevates them and lives with them and owns them. And liberalism is always trying to sort of make sense and rationalize contradictions. Liberalism gaslights us, right? And I think what I'm trying to do a little bit in this piece is to think about how psychoanalysis enables that too, right? How does psychoanalysis, which is, again, again, part of my argument also is like, I think psychoanalysis comes to its full self in the global South. Lara actually has a great line that psychoanalysis starts with Fanon, right? And that is, and to say, so I don't want to sort of shit talk psychoanalysis completely, it's not here or there, but to think about the sort of work it does within its liberalism that serves to erase particular forms of violence that is enacted through the contradiction of capitalism, right? That's kind of what I'm trying to work at here. And I think at certain moments in history, those contradictions, like the disinvitation of Said, come to the fore, right? They become so, right, the system breaks. The system breaks because the system is like, okay, are you really like, okay, you really think about everyone's cool and everyone's, humanity and we're all humans, but are they, right? So Vienna cannot handle this. Vienna can't handle the humanity of oppressed peoples, right? When it breaks that system. So that's kind of what I'm trying to get at here. I don't know. I mean, I see where you're going, and it's a big question, but I just kind of wanted to bend it back to kind of what the work is happening in the what I'm trying to get at in the piece. And I think theory works like that. That's my point. Like, when is it that we operationalize theory so much until it comes upon the true contradictions of capitalism, for example, right? And in which way then we have to sort of bend back or do acrobatics or whatever. And that's where liberalism steps in. I don't know if that's clear or not, but
yeah. But when theory has to be reminded to remain as elemental as a stone, that it can't, if it goes too far adrift into its abstractionisms, it's functioning often to become a part of the splitting mechanism,
right?
And that's hopefully not what theory was intending to do in the first place.
But I also just want to note something too. Like, I think I always have difficulty with, it sounds kind of cliche, with like these sort of binaries of like abstraction versus the material, or abstraction versus like experience, right? And I think, I was just hearing an interview with Dylan Rodriguez, who was saying about like the fascists nowadays have no problem with abstraction, right? They have no problem with sort of like having this ideal imaginary that they are very hard trying to, speak into the world, right? And I think sometimes, again, this is where liberalism kind of sometimes it allows us to dream, but it frees us to dream, just like this glissant point, right? This glissant point is like, it allows you to dream, go think, being thoughtful, be artistic, be creative, but it should be there in the realm of thought. It shouldn't be in the street. It shouldn't ever really pour into people's lives. So I kind of want to also push up always against these ideas of like the tension between abstraction and practice, right? I mean, for those of you who practice clinically, abstraction flows in this space of embodiment, right? So that's kind of also where I'm a little bit sort of heading a little bit in this piece.
Yeah, that's really, really helpful, and an important reminder. I do think I even fall into the binary of abstraction, versus the concrete or the elemental, and that's not as helpful. You're right. In the clinical space, it's a dance between sort of the theoretical formulation and this person's lived experience in such a way that they're mutually, it's dialectical and not as two separate things, and they play.
Yeah, and it's important because, it's easy for us. Look, number one, I think we want to think about liberal humanism as really, it's a provincial thought. It's a thought of Europe that gets sort of spread all over and actually becomes a mechanism by which, an ideological sort of mechanism by which it justifies the sort of, state sort of taking over the world, basically, and standardization of the world. But apart from that, really, if we think also, even in Europe, right, and you talked about Levinas, even in Europe, folks of the 20th century are very much, they understand this contradiction of embodiment, the tension between embodiment and experience and abstraction and self and other and sameness and otherness, right? So you have Merleau-Ponty, and he talks about the flesh of the world, right? And you have Bataille, and you have what he calls base materialism, and you have Althusser, and I forgot what he called it, but like somehow there is a sense, it's not just like, this is not just a sort of I mean, they get it too, right? This is not just sort of a decolonial sort of a theory of the South, and there is a sort of like something within colonial modernity that actually births its own death. And I think this is again the sort of displaced embodiment of theory. I don't know if that fully makes sense, but yeah, I just kind of you're talking about Levinas kind of made me think about that.
Yeah,
yeah.
Really interesting. Well, let's go to a couple of our audience members. The first question says, this is an incredible presentation, and as a person of color, I feel like words have been put to experiences and concepts that I haven't been able to describe. Are there curricula or programs that further explore these themes in a more structured and longitudinal way?
Wow.
Can we be sent a list of references and resources that have been referenced in this talk? So that's
Absolutely.
Of course something we can send along. But are there spaces and programs and curricula, like if you had to send someone on this journey to sort of catch up with you a little bit on this, are there places you think to for them?
Oh yeah. Okay. Woo. So to my sibling who asked that question, number one, you're always welcome to reach out, and I'm happy to to give you whatever reading I can. I'm going to just say this, and maybe this is not answering the question, but I'm definitely going to answer this way. And I think I'm just going to tell you about my own journey, right? My own journey is that for the past 25 years, I myself have been interested in the global South, and in particular, the Arab world. And in particular, I've been always concerned and really thinking about what does the world look like through the experience of Arabs. We call this now indigeneity, or some sort of, we're centering the indigenous, okay? This is not to say that like to reify the West or East binary. It's not. It's just to think about the ways in which we think about these things. So I think now this whole sort of journey, I look back over the past 10 years, I kind of have learned that there's something called the decolonial movement. So you can start with people like Chihai, or these sort of primers. Francois Vergès has a great, very fantastic book called Decolonial Feminism, which is like something everybody should read, and it's amazing. So I mean, there's tons of wonderful work about decolonial studies, and decolonial studies means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. In Turtle Island here, there's a whole experience of indigenous people, which is also a very differentiated experience that folks are writing about. So you have Kihalani Kawanui, you have Nick Estes, you have Kim Tolber, you have tons of people. In Palestine, there's anything that you read about Palestine, it's about a settler colonial condition. About South Africa, there are tons of people who are writing about South Africa and the sort of history of settler colonialism, apartheid and post-apartheid. So there's tons of work that, and I'm happy, again, if anyone reaches out to me, please feel free. I'm happy to share whatever I can. So.
Excellent. You have a couple of challenging questions coming your way.
Right.
So this next one, and I apologize for mispronouncing the name immediately, but this participant saying that Sylvia Rivera Cusicanqui has criticized post-colonial and decolonial studies in the palaces of empire, aka US universities, for the ways in which they extract ideas from the global South and regurgitate them in universities in the US. How does your concept of the decolonial now, your bridging of decolonial discourses and practices, counteract and resist the depoliticization of anti-colonial thought, practices, and action and theory arising from the global South by US scholars?
Wow, a big question. I think that's a great question. I mean, I have to say I have a hard time with being grandiose, so do forgive me. How do I want to say that the question itself, I completely agree with. And the answer, I would say, is precisely what I'm trying to do in this piece. My work in general actually always seeks to elevate anti-colonial thinkers, anti-colonial militants, and to have them think through the conditions of coloniality for us, to learn from them. I have this idea of that we have our theoretical and militant ancestors who are now dead. So you have Nkrumah and Sankara and Fanon, Césaire. And you then have our, let's say, anti-colonial elders. So people who are still around, let's say Angela Davis or someone even like Homi Bhabha, and then you have our siblings, the people who are around us now, and the people who are younger than me, who I keep learning. And it's really a dialectic of learning those from those people, and always keeping centered the people of the South. That always keeping centered the colonized, always keeping centered the racialized, always keeping centered the marginalized, right? To not ever use the global South as material, because that's what happens, right? This is kind of what I'm arguing against. I'm arguing against the way in which theory operationalizes the global South or the colonial world or people of color and uses them as material for academic outputs and sexy thought, but really never ever, embodies or actualizes the true potentiality of that theory. So I agree with you completely, and hopefully I didn't give any sort of extractive sense of the work that I'm doing. Quite to the contrary, I want to always make sure to elevate the folks who I hope that this work is serving, not actually studying.
Excellent, thank you. This next question is, thank you so much, Professor Chihai, for the illuminating talk. I'm reflecting on your thoughts about racial dissociation and the alienated, colonized subject that is produced. I've encountered this often in clinical situations, an identification with the oppressor and internalization of white supremacy, resulting in libidinal reorganization of the self, self-hate, distance from community, and self-defeating patterns. I wonder how to take this up in a psychoanalytic technique. I've seen it theorized as a false self kind of situation, a la Winnicott, and worked through as such with clear limits. What are your thoughts on that conceptual resonance, and what would have to be reconfigured? And you can call Laura too if you want to have a lifeline on this.
That's yeah. I mean, so I'm not a clinician, as you all know, although I play one on TV. It's just a great question. And in presenting our work, Laura and I, what's remarkable is that we hear parallel stories from folks of color here in Turtle Island that we hear from our siblings in Palestine, right? So this idea where your white supervisor will just tell a Black trainee that their Black patient is just, has no interiority, or they don't, need no therapeutic intervention and just need to medicate them, right? So we so many times we go places and people are like, yeah, this happened to us. So I wish I could give you technical advice, but I can tell you this much. From the incredibly smart way you put that question, you already are on the path to a de-alienated sense of self, where you're all going to be able to figure this out intuitively through practice, right? I think we're at an amazing time in psychology, where I do think right now there is a birth of, or there's not a birth, maybe just a sort of a convergence of really smart folks who are coming together, and young folks who are coming together, who form a sibling bond, who are going to be able to also give community to you. So I wish I could be more detailed, but I think number one, it sounds like you have it. And number two is having courage to refuse, like Ali, to refuse to be hailed, to be conscripted, when you know something is going on, when you know that a racial enactment is happening, you know it, and you have to be able to refuse that in a way that you can. Now, what we don't say, and what the conversation between David and I, what is absent is power. And that's the Manganyi point. And that's the Ali point. There are, when you refuse, there's also, okay, you're not going to be licensed, right? So, but I want you to always know that you have the choice to not enter into that, right? But I commend you for the amazing question. So thank you.
So I'm going to heckle you now, as I promised I would, and take you up on that last statement, where you're saying with a lot of hopefulness that there's a convergence taking place, that, you know, that psychology is in a sense having to face this, and there's enough things coming together at this point that it is contending anew in a very different way with a lot of its previous sensibilities. And I would agree that that is being seen in certain pockets of highly marginalized psychologies, such as psychoanalysis. And when you look at the field more broadly, the operationalization that you've spoken about in this talk is in full and healthy form. And by healthy, I mean that facetiously, that it remains quite intact, where we simply, like a question like this wonderful participant, could not even be asked in a meaningful way, because really we're just working with highly generalized cognition types and schemas that are preset, and there's a manualization of the psyche and psychic process for healing, such that we get to just keep bypassing. Like, they're literally, you know, the theoretical frame and the language that we parse out human experience through gets to bypass the stone altogether. Right. And so I think that the field of psychology has built something very effectively shielding itself from having to ask these questions. And even, this is controversial for me to say, even a lot of the multicultural and indigenous psychology movements get swept into the highly structuralized, manualized, cognitive schematized versions of the field, and that it doesn't allow the convergence to actually make its way into what is typically happening in almost any clinic outside of these, the ones that you and I are privileged to enjoy the conversations in.
Right. No, I agree. So, you know, I hear you completely. Number one is, let's not fool ourselves. Capitalism is a violent system and we live in it. Racial capitalism is a violent system and we live in it. There's no reason why psychology should be seen as apart from that. Psychology is a product of that, and psychology serves that. Psychoanalysis is a product of that, and psychoanalysis will serve that, right? So, I mean, we come up with this idea of psychoanalysis innocence because it's there and it structures the field. It is a violent field if we let it. And in terms of I completely hear you in terms of manualization and, you know, what do they call it? Outcomes, scientific outcomes, I forget what they call it, I completely hear you. Power will come after you. Power is there only, and you feel power when you pinch it, right? Power is diffuse, and we walk around and I'm walking down, I take my dog, it doesn't matter, I don't feel it, right? But if I go and I have my dog go crap on the cop's lawn, I'm going to feel power. Because the cops aren't going to let me do that. Why? Because they're cops, not for any other reason, right? Because it's their job to enact power on subjects. That's their raison d'etre. Okay, so I agree with you completely. But we have to understand one thing. Change is not going to, this number one, psychoanalysis, just like comparative literature, has to change or die. It must become relevant or die. And to become relevant means you have to challenge systems. Now, what you're saying is you don't look for CBT or anything like that to jump on the stone and talk about jump on the bandwagon and talk about the stone. I agree with you. But the way we move forward is actually forging through community, right? And this is kind of also what we think of, what we learn. We learn from the Palestinians this, right? It's through forging community. And those communities become insurgent communities, right? And we know from people we see that the field is changing because these folks are insurgents and they're brilliant, right? Now, the real theory is, and the real threat, I mean, is the next step, is when is it going to be adopted and appropriated, right? When does the discourse of decolonization, for example, become the metaphor, right? As Tuck and Yang say, right? So I completely agree with you. I don't think that we should be looking for the APA for guidance, right? But we can look for things like you're doing or Lara's doing, is building communities and building networks. And within that critical mass of insurgency, you do have change happening. So I don't know. I don't want to be like psychoanalysis is really good. I couldn't care less about psychoanalysis or anything. I care about revolution. I care about revolution. I care about liberation. However we get there. And I do think that within this community that there is a possibility to build a revolutionary community.
Well, you just answered in part one of the audience members' questions, and maybe I'll read it to you just so we can come circle to it, and you can add one more point, even if you feel like you want to add something. Thank you so much for this radical talk that breathes life. Can you please give us examples of epistemic insurgency? How does an anarchic, whoa, the questions are coming in, so now things are shifting around, sorry. Oh, it disappeared for a sec. Give me 1 sec. I want to get that back. Okay, how does an anarchist, communist, anti-fascist academic clinician sustain that insurgence under the crush of fascism, especially in the wake of current settler colonial policies?
Mm-hmm. You don't do it alone. You can't do it alone. Psychoanalysis makes and shores up individuals, right? But psychoanalysis, if it's wise, can also find its, let's call it, embryonic force in connecting individuals and making collectives and understanding individuals only are products of communities. So I say, you don't ever think about doing this alone. I would say I would never tell any revolutionary to do anything alone, because you're alone and then you have the whole weight of the state against you, right? It's not about being alone. That's how neoliberal bourgeois thought makes us think that we need to change the world individually one by one. If I go and I recycle enough, I'm going to stop global warming. If I get off meat, I'm going to stop global warming or whatever, right? Not to say that you should be eating meat or burning plastic. I'm not saying that, but it's not about individuals. It's about building movements. There is a movement. If you're an anarchist, communist, anarcho-Marxist, right on, you're a comrade and I'm with you, and I ask you to reach out to me, and I'm happy to connect you in ways to comrades and siblings that I know, because work is being done now. So have faith and have hope, because the revolution is coming, and the revolutionaries are out there. So please feel free to reach out to me.
One more question. It's a good one to end on, I think. Thank you so much, Professor Chihai, for the incredible presentation. I was particularly moved by the reading of your Darwish's poem. Since you ended with Darwish's words, I'm wondering, where does poetry figure in this convergence between psychoanalysis and decoloniality following your invitation?
Say the last bit again.
Since you ended with Darwish's words, I'm wondering, where does poetry figure in this convergence between psychoanalysis and decoloniality following your invitation?
Thank you. So for all Arabic speakers, I apologize for mutilating the poem. I didn't practice it enough. I just found it today. I had another poem and I saw that one. I wanted to use that one instead. So, but with that said, I think it's funny if you read someone like Edward Glissant, who I struggled with for so long. And then recently, over the past year, I opened it back up, and it was like reading a new book. And it taught me something that I already knew, but it sort of enacted something that you already knew, but don't really know, right? And that is, poetry and literature and culture are our intellectual texts. They're the texts of our life, right? And they're as operational as theory or a manual, right? So I think where where poetry is within the nexus of psychoanalysis and decoloniality. I think decoloniality allows us to connect poetry as a genuine form of expression that tries to think beyond binaries and beyond these sorts of ways in which we are disciplined, right? And so if psychoanalysis is trying to sometimes unwire, in its best of possible ways, unwire these disciplinary mechanisms that have really screwed us up, like that's why I'm here sitting on the couch with you, right? Somehow I've been really up by something, right? And psychoanalysis is going to help me try to unwire this and connect with an understanding, a consciousization, and disalienization. That is also kind of what poetry does. It's a place that allows us to connect and to rewire the way we think about this world, to disalienate ourselves. Because our alienated self looks at poetry and goes, that's just poetry, dude. How useless, right? But when we allow it to speak as a lived text, as a lived object, as something that has life and relational life to the world, then we start to connect and it makes sense and it becomes a guide. And that's, I mean, I think psychoanalysis, I'm also arguing that we need to do that with theory as well, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know if that is a coherent enough answer, but
I think to the fact that poetry is an invitation in a way that theory, as it's currently practiced, can never be. I mean, theory doesn't often invite us to fuller range of experience, whereas poetry, provokes, evokes, and invites the fuller frame of human practice and theory in a way that's not in that binary form, as you described so well. So,
right. I mean, Glissant, Césaire, Breton, these are all examples of kind of that dismantling of thinking about these sort of ideas that somehow poetry is over here and theory is over here, and
yeah, it's all human. Any last things you'd want to say as we close up? Last words, last thoughts.
Last thoughts. I want to thank you, and I want to thank all these incredible folks and siblings in the audience, and for the folks who gave us these amazing questions. Hopefully, I did them justice. I think again, I mean, I hear these questions more as sort of guides for me to sort of, you're teaching me as much as anything else, and I really appreciate it. And I'm so happy that you connected with the work in that way. I mean, it's very early on in the work, so I very much value the opportunities to all of you. So thank you.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks.
I would look forward to raising drinks before too long with one another and celebrating the end of the term, the end of the series. And thank you so much for blessing us with your presence and again, your wisdom and your work in this world. So
thank you.
Be well, everyone, and we'll see you before long. Many blessings.
Thank you. Thank you, Darby. Thank you, Haley.